Is that them can't wait? Is that them can't wait?
There you go. That's phrase of the day. Last one. I'm only putting it in there because I don't really understand it. It's pretty funny. Anyway, hope you're all doing well. Where are we at? Try and get this chat back up. There we go. Let's stick this up here. Stick that down there and there. All right. So move this over a little bit. Hopefully you'll have as much fun with this class as I did. Spent most of yesterday working on it because it was a massive rabbit hole to jump down. Can you all hear me okay? I've got my audio up high enough?
Yes, sir.
You're good.
Okay, good. Anyway, so it's just kind of an indulgence on my behalf of thinking about some of the pros and cons of trying to get to these places, right? So I'm a avid sci-fi film and watcher and book reader, and this whole PowerPoint is peppered with references to that. Actually, can anybody know what this ghetto shit?
Yeah, of course. I got you.
One of my favorite sci-fi films of all time.
Yeah, Neil Blomkamp crushed it. Great movie. Great movie.
Mm-hmm. In fact, every time I think of the pig scene towards the end when he's in that big alien walker thing, just brings me to tears. I'll have to see if I can find a clip of it later on. Don't want to get too distracted, right?
What movie are y'all talking about?
District 9.
Yeah, District 9.
Oh yeah.
Although I really like Chappie as well. Chappie does. That's also one of my favorites. So District 9 was just fabulous. Be Robert Hill, I guess. Anyway, so basically the idea is that the distances are huge, right? And there are a lot of issues with that. And essentially the laws of physics are pretty uncompromising. And so one of the issues with distance is obviously speed. And the issue with speed is acceleration, right? To be able to attain a suitable speed to cross a distance quickly. And the issue with acceleration is reaction mass, right? So how do you actually accelerate something up to sufficient speed to get somewhere quickly, right? And obviously, I don't think it's all bound to like an inky black disgusting liquid in a little tube, as is the case in District 9. That was a little bit of a stretch, I think. But there are lots of different ways of thinking about how those issues can be addressed, right? So obviously, the simplest one would be not to send people, but to send probes. Has everybody seen Paul? Just out of curiosity.
Yes.
Watched that with the kids a little while back. That was pretty hilarious. Not entirely.
It's in that movie.
What's that?
I haven't seen that movie.
Oh, you should. It is so funny.
You said it's called Paul?
Yep, just Paul.
Yeah.
Oh, with Seth Rogen?
With Seth
Yes,
Rogen?
with Seth Rogen.
Never mind.
Yeah.
I'll add it to the list.
It's pretty awesome in a whole bunch of different ways. And anyway, and if you want to send people, then there's a whole bunch of issues all over the place, basically, right? And this is even just assuming that we're going to try and go to Proxima B, right? Proxima Centauri, which is only 4 light years away. Even that is kind of an astonishing trick. And I think, what was it? if we were to go as fast as the New Horizons probe is going, I actually met a guy who did some work on that the other day, which was pretty cool. And that's, how fast is that? That's going at something like, I don't know, 200,000 kilometers an hour or something like that. So crazy fast. That would take us about 130,000 years to get to Proxima B, which is a really long time. I'm not even sure if there'll be anything left back on Earth at that point. Anyway, and so there are a bunch of different kind of issues around that. So I had a lot of fun making this PowerPoint. So the issue of probes is actually kind of along the whole, Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook, let's actually Elon Musk and a whole bunch of other people are in the habit of doing this, making like cool sounding stuff and snazzy presentations. But one of the plans is this thing called Breakthrough Starshot, right? So it's got lots of cool names. I think the things that they're sending will have nano put in front of them, so that obviously sounds more impressive. I think they're called nano chips or nanosats or something like that. So small little probes basically. And the idea, let's see if we can get this to play. Come on. It's pretty short. Is to use as Mike Myers would say, frickin' lasers. Oh, question from Robertson. The answer to that is yes. And essentially use lasers as the reaction mass, right? The thing that provides propulsion. So have a spacecraft up in space, punting out these little things. Oh God, there he is. Can't stand that guy. Little rinky-dink nanosat or nano chip or whatever they call it in the middle, and then a 5-meter sail. Actually, this is an interesting part of sci-fi, using solar sails, right, to get places. Actually, is it Count Dooku's ship in one of the early Star Wars films has sails as well. And anyway, and then the idea is just to get all these giant lasers, right, on the ground, presumably, or even in space, and then fire the lasers at that 5-meter probe, and that will accelerate it to by about 10,000 Gs, right? So there you go. Easy peasy, right? Giant freaking lasers. And that should, in theory, at least, get to Proxima B in about 20 to 30 years. And so those probes will be traveling at, what is it, about 1/5 of the speed of light, give or take. So astonishingly fast. Not sure what they'll actually be able to capture as they go through the system, and they're gone, right? There's a planet there. But anyway, that's the idea behind that. So essentially, having something very small means that the amount of reaction mass that is required to accelerate it is also proportionally smaller, or for the same amount of mass, you can go an awful lot faster. So I think that's a pretty cool idea. Whether it'll actually happen or not, who knows? A lot of this is just standing around drinking expensive coffee and making fancy animations, to be honest. I think is kind of my take on that. An awful lot like what Elon Musk does, to be honest. But with humans, there's a lot of issues, right? So one, we're soft and squishy. So typically you can stand about 5G acceleration before you pass out, and 10 Gs before you start dying. Actually, the highest measured G-force experienced by a human was 45 Gs by a guy who's strapped to a rocket sled. I don't know what he was doing on there, but he achieved about 43 or 44 Gs, and he was fine. Lived to 89, supposedly, on some farm in Kansas or something like that. And I think in NASCAR or sprint cars or one of those, one of the drivers quite some time ago hit a wall at, they think, about 200 Gs, and he was fine too. I'm not sure you'd notice the difference with a NASCAR driver, to be honest, whether they're fine or not. They seem to be fairly the singular people. Anyway, so that's an issue, right? So you can't obtain high speeds by rapid acceleration because we'll just squish, right? We don't live for very long, so if you go slowly, then there's a good chance we'll be dead. Whoever's in the astronaut, even if you put, like, 5-year-olds in charge of a rocket, which would be a bad idea, I think. Then they'd almost certainly be dead before they get to their destination, which would be sad, obviously.
Would it be insane to think about multiple generations on the same ship?
Yeah, there we go. That's actually one of the things we're going to talk about in a little bit, which is kind of one of a pretty solid foundation of sci-fi. An awful lot of books and films feature generation ships, and we'll get into that and potential issues in a bit. And also that fuel has mass, right? So essentially, if you think about, like, the rockets that we punt up into space right now, like the Delta rockets or the Ariane rockets, almost all of that mass is propellant fuel, right? And these are chemical rockets as well, right? They're not things like ion jets or whatever. And a very small fraction is the actual payload, right? So if you think about going for even further distances, not just escaping our gravity well, but actually getting somewhere a long way away, you have to take a lot of fuel. And obviously that either makes the spacecraft bigger, which means you need more fuel, or you can carry less stuff, right? So, and with humans, there's a little kind of a minimum requirement of what you have to take. And so I've split this into 4 options. This is my take on things. I'm sure there are more educated takes on it. One is a constant acceleration drive ship, right, which is also a pretty common feature in sci-fi. And this is actually crazy. If you can accelerate a constant 1g, you as an individual can cross the entire galaxy in 12 years, personal time, which sounds pretty neat, right? Obviously, due to time dilation, over 100,000 years has passed for the people that you leave behind, which causes obviously all kinds of problems. Time dilation is actually a really, it's a really funky thing to get your head around. And if you want a really cool book, I'll type it in the. This is one of my favorite books of all times. Oops, did I type that right? Yep. This is an extraordinarily good book. It's actually based on the author's experiences coming back from the Vietnam War to the US, kind of a societal dislocation, essentially. But that has time dilation as a central part of the plot, and it's a really cool book, well worth reading. So anyway, distraction. Second option is what I call freeze the peeps. So the idea there is that you just, stick the astronauts or whatever travelers in a freezer and defrost them when you get there. All right. So even if it takes, a few hundred years to get from one place to another. Mass Effect. Was that a game?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I ever played that. And this is like, what is it? All of the Alien films feature cryosleep. There's Passengers. What else we got? Oh yeah, Interstellar as well. A huge number of sci-fi films, because it actually makes life a lot simpler for the plot writers. It's like, oh, you don't have to just hang around getting bored off your ass. Oh, people got frozen. Cool, thank you, Kiara. You just stick him in the freezer and you just wake him up. Oh, Avatar, that was another one as well. The third option is what Jimmy was asking about, which is generation ships. And aside from the whole ethical issues of, you know, your kids are the ones that get there and they don't have any choice about it. There are also other kind of problems with that. So that gets around the whole kind of mass, like reaction mass and acceleration issue, but deals with the time issue by just, you know, having people reproduce over time in a sealed container, basically, until some of them at some point get wherever they're going. That's actually a fairly what can I say, dark view of interstellar travel. It's really just, you know, punting people off alone, right? I mean, there's no kind of, as you'd imagine, like Viking ships, you know, 1,000 years or so. Yeah, they're just
go figure out what's out there.
yeah, exactly. But there's no chance you'll ever. I mean, you'd be able to kind of communicate, maybe, with a lag of I don't know, probably 1,000 years or so to get a you know, reply back, potentially, depending on how far you're going. But you're never going to see other people. You know, that's it. You're a colony and you're on your own. So it's a pretty dark view of space travel, I think. You know, colonization. Hang on, what did Vivian say?
But isn't that any? How is that any different than how we've been colonizing things for all time? You know what I mean? It's always
Exactly.
been by yourself.
Yeah, that's very.
You're stuck with the people that you've been with, and you're going off into an unknown place.
That's very true. Yeah, and very much kind of pre-Dark Ages. I mean, I guess in Polynesia, the island hopping peoples did very much the same thing. You know, they kind of went out on their boats and maybe found an island, but they're sure as shit weren't going to be going back. You know, even if they could find their way back.
I mean, is it any darker than staying here and watching the planet die?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's just there's an awful lot of meat on that bone, I think, in terms of philosophy. That's for sure. Oh, quick question from Vivian. What do you do with the dead bodies? Grandpa becomes soil, which becomes your food, basically. They're a closed ecosystem, these generation ships, so you can't waste anything. Actually, there's I'll talk about a book in a little bit, which is yeah, there you go, Kiara. I mean, it's essentially like Earth isn't. You are eating your everybody that came before you. Their atoms are passing through you. You know, I mean, there's nothing new created on Earth. It's just happens to be a very large ecosystem, right? Where's my dog? She's still sleeping because she's a lazy dog, teenager. She's upstairs. Yeah, same as on the Martian. Although for the Martian, that was more because there was no organic life or matter in the regolith, so he didn't have any soil. And soil is essentially a mixture of kind of dust and rock grains and things like that, plus organic matter. And so he was making soil from regolith, which is just the dust and rock part, like you have on the moon, essentially, and his buddy's poo. And so that made the soil, and that created a substrate that the potatoes could grow in. But yeah, so that's kind of the same sort of thing, but it's actually pretty weird. There's another book that I've got to recommend in a little bit too, when I get there. And so the easy option, at least in terms of plot lines and sidestepping all that, you know, awkward stuff, is just to travel faster than light. If you can travel, which is called superluminal travel, which I think is pretty neat, then you don't have any of those issues, right? You don't have to worry about, you know, freezing people because you just get there like that. No generation is going to be an issue. You don't have to worry about what to do with Grandpa's body. Yeah, it's pretty easy. Obviously, there are some other technical challenges involved driving faster than light, and we'll get to those in a wee bit. So the more you read into this stuff, like the crazier shit becomes. And this is one of my favorite ones. And so this is what's called a constant acceleration drive ship. You should read up about Project Orion. And this is actually features in Proxima, a book called Proxima, which is all about going to Proxima B. And it uses a constant acceleration drive ship. And essentially the idea behind this, and this will crack you up, is you see this big plate, orbital battleship, my ass. Anyway, big plate at the bottom. That's called the pusher plate. And then you got these struts. Those are shock absorbers like you have on your car, basically. The idea is that you drop nuclear bombs out the back of the rocket and detonate them very quickly, like once every 5 seconds, give or take. And so, yeah, you know, sounds like a terrible idea. And the explosion of those the bombs, basically provides the reaction mass and the thrust by pressing against the pusher plate, and that just pushes the plate along. So it's kind of like those. Don't know if you've ever seen those little candle boats that go pa 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 around. They use a candle as a way of heating water and propelling out of the back. It's kind of like that, but with nuclear bombs. It's like bang, 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 and get where you're going.
But you still have to carry the fuel like your original thought, right? You have to carry all the bombs.
You
or
do.
You just make them en route.
No, you can't do that because there's no way you're going to find that much
you need
mass.
a reactor. Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah.
So yeah, you have to carry all the bombs with you. And actually, if you read some of because you know, clever people did some of the design on this. The lightweight version of one of these would be about 400,000 tons, which is just astonishing. And of that, 300,000 tons would be nuclear warheads.
And now, it's just the warhead. It's not even the ballistic rocket. Just the warhead's all you need, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, would you need the rocket though if you're just going to drop it out while you're already moving?
Yeah,
so
just the warhead.
You don't. I mean, earlier on, they actually proposed these things taking off from the Earth's surface, until someone pointed out that detonating lots of nuclear warheads in the atmosphere is generally a bad idea. Which, it's like, do you guys not think about that? But anyway, like later iterations, and this was really just a thought exercise, right? Was to have the rocket in, like the spacecraft, let's say in space, assembled in near Earth orbit, and then have it start on its way up there. To Kiara, no, because that pusher plate is actually designed to be slowly ablated or worn away by the explosions. If you use particular types of material, actually they talked about using plywood, which I think is absolutely crazy, like from the other side. But if you use like copper with oil on it or something like that, supposedly there's very little wearing of that pusher plate. Supposedly, you know, I mean, this is.
So for the outward expansion of the explosion, wouldn't you reach a peak velocity eventually?
Well, essentially, yes. I mean, they actually worked out that this would reach a significant fraction of the speed of light if this went on for long enough. So if you accelerate a 1g for long enough, I don't know how many. I think it's like something like 4 or 5 years at 1g constant. You will achieve like 0.95 c. You know, 95% of the speed of light. Even though from your own perspective, you won't be traveling necessarily that fast, but the perspective of the planetary observer, you would be, which would also cause other kinds of issues, particularly time dilation. But yeah, so I actually personally think this was like, well, we've got a shit ton of nuclear warheads we don't know what to do with. What can we use them for? And after a while, NASA's like, what do I want this for? I don't have anywhere to go. So it was canned. And actually, the nuclear testing ban kind of knocked this one on the head because they couldn't actually do any of the experiments to figure out if it would work or not. The next one, refinement of that, this was actually from the Brits, smart people, was a nuclear fusion rocket, right? And so this is a kind of I don't know, picture of one, I guess, compared to a Saturn V rocket, which are freaking enormous things. If you've ever been to the Johnson Space Center in Houston, which if you haven't, I'd strongly recommend it. But anyway, this is, instead of using nuclear explosions, this is basically igniting, I think, deuterium pellets and using that kind of in this chamber at the back to provide the thrust, but a kind of similar kind of idea. And the reason behind like the whole attractiveness of nuclear stuff is that it is the most efficient means of providing thrust for a given mass. Chemical rockets are particularly for constant acceleration, pretty crappy, to be honest. So yeah, there you go. That's one way of doing it. So a different way would be, and we've got some really like far out stuff coming up in a little bit. But the other option is one of my favorites, which is freeze the peeps. And this is, as I said, it's like a absolute like central part of an awful lot of sci-fi, right? Because it just makes things easier. And actually, they do talk about time dilation in the Alien series. Actually, Interstellar talks about it a lot. When you get around to watching that, it's really kind of crazy how it's dealt with. And so you get time dilation from two things. One is speed and one is proximity to mass. So they actually can measure this, like on, how does it work? The higher the gravity, the faster the time goes. And so if you're on the International Space Station, your time actually passes slightly faster than it would if you're on Earth. And so all of the GPS satellites up there actually have to take into account that time dilation, even just from that small change in the effect of gravity, right? But speed also has the effect. So the faster you travel, the slower time passes for you relative to those that are observing you travel away from them. And so Ripley, I think when she comes back in the second one, Aliens, plural.
Yeah, it's like 42 and her daughter's like 100 something.
Yeah, I think her daughter's already died.
Yeah.
Something like that. Although she's still got a cat, so that's okay. I'm sure she feels better. And a lot of this is actually based off of organisms. Oh, hang on, got a question here. Yeah, so there's a whole series on Netflix, Vivian, about those two. I haven't got around to watching it yet. So yeah, the twin that went up on the space station for a year is time goes a little faster, so he's a little older than the one that was left back on Earth, because time has passed. Hang on, get this round the right way. Time passes faster than gravity. No, he's a little bit younger. You're right. Yeah. So yeah, I've got to watch that. I just haven't got around to it yet. I had other things to occupy my time. But yeah, there's an awful lot of cool stuff that come out of that experiment. But anyway, the whole idea of cryosleep or hypersleep is that bunch of organisms do that, right? So found out yesterday that Arctic ground squirrels, very cute looking things, actually go into cryogenic stasis for about 12 days at a time, where they are, to all intents and purposes, dead. and then they just, I don't know, shake their fluffy butts a little bit, and then they wake up somehow, I don't know how, and get around and do stuff, flush all those toxins out, and then they can go back to sleep again. Hang on. I'll look it up for you, Vivian. I don't know off the top of my head right now, but I'll check it out and I'll let you know. And also, obviously, bears are another example. Funnily enough, is when I was reading about the Arctic ground squirrels, they mentioned that they're a tasty snack for badgers. I don't know they had badgers in the Arctic, and so technically speaking, if a badger found a hibernating ground squirrel, it wouldn't even know that it was dead, because it would just be, you know, eaten. So anyway, so there's an awful lot of hope about that. There's a lot of hope for essentially very rich old people who have diseases that would like to be frozen for long enough until a cure for that disease is developed, right? And that's actually one of the plot lines in Prometheus, which is part of the Alien kind of series, and also super cool film. And yeah, and so the idea is essentially you need to cool a person's body down so low that metabolic processes slow down to the point where they're barely detectable. And so that is, I don't know what the temperature is. There are all kind of different temperatures proposed, but certainly close to freezing. But the issue with that is obviously you get ice crystals form, and those destroy cells and proteins. And so another part is, and I don't know, you don't have in here, obviously cryogenics was not as advanced back in the alien days. But all the other ones typically involve some kind of liquid. You know, if you watch Event Horizon, you know, there's this liquid in the couch. Presumably that also protects from the effects of acceleration as well. But that liquid is proposed to be like some kind of antifreeze that you have injected into your body, and it basically flushes out a lot of the water, so that when you do go into cryosleep, you know, you don't burst from ice crystals forming. So that's the idea behind that. I haven't really got very far on getting it to work, and the kind of central problem is it's very ethically dubious, you know, freezing a person when you're not entirely sure if you can revive them again. At least experimentally. If they choose that, I mean, that's their own problem. But so we haven't actually defrosted someone that's been frozen yet. I think there've been a few people that have been cryogenically frozen, but I don't think anyone's got the guts to try and defrost them yet, just in case it doesn't work, because then they're officially dead.
So I've got a surgical book from World War II where it talks about how the Germans had run lots of experiments on that to try and sustain life for surgical procedures, where they'll, like, you know, bring you just above freezing to slow everything down so they'll have more time on the surgical table.
Yeah, and
but those were Nazis.
Yeah, and that's also, I mean, there's an awful lot that we did learn through the experiments of the Nazis, which we can't do now because obviously it's ethically bankrupt, right? But there is actually, I'm trying to think for strokes and other kind of cardiac infarctions that they will try and chill you down. One of the responses to that is to cool you down as much as possible, particularly for strokes, because that then slows the kind of like the oxidative burst afterwards when blood supply is re-established. So actually, not so much for surgeries now, but certainly for certain types of stroke and things like that, it is part of
cool.
An EMT's response to cool you down as quickly as possible. And I think there's even some kind of liquids that they inject. I'm not 100% sure about that, to do the same kind of thing. Essentially to kind of, because a lot of the damage and strokes is caused by not the blockage, although that obviously causes problems with oxygen starvation. But when that blockage is removed or breaks down, the flush of oxygenated blood to that region causes all kinds of reactive oxygen intermediates to be produced, and that actually causes more damage than the stroke itself.
No, all the free radicals bouncing around, tears up
Yeah.
the DNA.
And it's actually called what is it? Ischemia reperfusion injury there. And the reperfusion part is the resumption of blood supply. So there's kind of like for hypersleep, there's kind of like tantalizing, bits around the periphery that this might be possible. But I don't know, it's still very much science fiction, that's for sure. And I'm not entirely sure how it would ever get to the point where we could even test it out, given medical ethics and the like. Perhaps we need to go to China. Sorry, didn't hear me say that. They have a bit of a long-running issue with medical ethics.
Either that or we can genetically make a baby to withstand this.
Yes, that's right. Oh, we do that in China as well, because that seems to be okay. Actually, it's not okay. They said it's a very bad thing to genetically modify people. So we'll just have to take on that. Start with animals. Yeah, rats. You don't like rats, Kiara?
No, they're okay, but like we do a lot of testing on rats anyway.
Yeah, I don't know why. I don't know why. Perhaps it's because I haven't done enough reading into it, but it would be the obvious place to start. Yeah, it's kind of chicken and egg situation too, because we don't have the spacecraft with which to send these people anywhere. So, why would we bother freezing them? I don't know. That's for the future, I guess. So, getting to Jimmy's question. Haha. And actually, it was funny because when I was looking into this, I obviously clicked that the axiom in WALL-E, if anyone's seen that film, which is a really cool film, is an arc ship. It's a generation ship, so it's going to blast off Earth, and I think it's like 700 years tooling around the galaxy until WALL-E finds Eva and they fall in love and stuff like that. So anyway, so actually, if you watch WALL-E, there's a lot of astrobiology going on there. You just have to pay attention. Anyway, so the idea behind generation ships is essentially you travel more slowly, but you carry everything with you you need to sustain a population over that time, and that population will go through multiple generations until you finally get wherever you're going, right? And so people have done a lot of modeling of this, in terms of particularly how many people you need, and they find that it's about 100 people before issues with inbreeding, accidents, infertility, things like that start to become an issue. All right, that's from a purely theoretical modeling standpoint. I think about 100 people. Obviously, you have to take sufficient fuel with you, right? And this is going to be a large, spacecraft, right? Because you're going to have to support 100 people for, I don't know, what it would be, probably, I think it's about 500 or 600 years to get to Proxima B, even if you can go fairly fast. You have to carry all the water, right, that you need, right, which has considerable mass. You have to have sufficient space to grow all the food that you need, right? Because there's no way that you could carry enough food, even if they're like crappy dehydrated sea rations or something, to be able to live for 600 years for 100 people. And so it would be a very large spacecraft, and it would also be a closed ecosystem, right? So this is a really interesting kind of idea. And I've read a book about it, and I've been trying to remember the name of that book for ages. I actually found it yesterday. And so essentially there was a big NASA DARPA conference called the 100-Year Starship Program back in 2010 or thereabouts. And basically Kim Stanley Robinson, who's a real hard science fiction writer, does some really, really cool stuff. he was really pissed off by it. He just basically said it was like some kind of quasi-religious revivalist meeting or something like that, just for science fiction nerds. And so he wrote a book called The Aurora, which is also a really, really cool book. Let's put it down here. Here you go, I'll give you something to read over the summer, which basically described what he thought were the natural consequences of doing such a generation ship. And I don't want to tell you all the details because I don't want to spoil the book, but basically it's the issue of a closed ecosystem, right? So here on Earth, there are no truly closed ecosystems. I guess probably underneath the Lake Vostok, which is, shit, where is that? I think that's in Antarctica. I should know that better than this. It's probably only one of the few, right? Because I mean, even if you go to maybe some caves, right? But those are rarely actually truly closed ecosystems, right? So in a closed ecosystem, there is no biomass entering or leaving that system. There's no new genetic novelty arising, right, through migration or genetic inflow or outflow. So essentially, all of the genetic novelty, not just in the people, but also all of the plants, right? Oh, here we go. There she is. There you go. She's finally got up out of bed, waiting for her breakfast.
Hello, Daddy.
All of the genetic novelty you have, you bring with you, and obviously you can get around that a little bit by bringing basically people and plants frozen as embryos, right? So that you can, you know, implant them and grow them to people to kind of turn things over. But everything you bring with you is going to have to last you until you get there. And so the whole book is essentially about the fallacy of relying on that, essentially. And I don't want to tell you too much, but things basically fall to pieces, right? Because there are all kinds of unforeseen consequences of such a situation that you can't foresee before you actually try and do it. And so there's a lot of issues with the generation ship approach, right? It kind of rests on some fairly optimistic assumptions that that ecosystem will survive and maintain its optimal status for the length of time it needs to. And also because if any margin for error that you build in, let's say you think, okay, well, this ecosystem might decline in efficiency by, I don't know, 20% over 200 years, then you're going to have to build that margin for error into the spacecraft, which increases its mass, which then increases the amount of fuel you need, and so on and so forth, right? So there's not a lot of margin for error because all those margins cost a lot in terms of mass. And again, physics is pretty unforgiving. You can't get around the need to accelerate that mass. And so, yeah, it's a really interesting kind of take on the whole generation ship viewpoint. He's not a big fan, to be honest. He supposedly pissed off an awful lot of science fiction writers when he wrote that book, somewhat intentionally, I think. So, simple solution.
But all that is in fact based on theory as well, though, right? He's
Correct.
just taking the more pessimistic approach.
That's right.
Okay.
But also, I think from what we know about, I think there actually have been experiments on closed ecosystems, and they were all failed, largely because the people in them went nuts and wanted to kill each other.
Yeah, I could see that happening before anything else. Or like like you said, somebody's kid being like, well, I didn't get an option. Like, well, neither did the people that were born into slavery or poverty or the sex trade or everything else.
Right.
So anyway, just to touch on society.
So I think that kind of comes to our limited understanding of how ecosystems actually work, right? Because any ecosystem modeling that we do at present is really only representing a very small part of the complexity of that ecosystem, because there's simply too many different things to model, and we don't have the computing power to model all of them. And so I don't think it's really possible to know how well those things would work now. Maybe in the future it's possible. I don't know. But essentially it's that kind of law of unintended consequences, right? You know, what if you bring perhaps soil that has 1% higher phosphorus, you know, than what might be needed, right? Or 0.5% higher or something like that. Over time, that extra phosphorus might lead to, you know, a slightly higher growth rate of one thing over another, and then that outcompetes this. It uses a little bit more oxygen, you know, it causes a little bit more water production. And the thing is, in an open ecosystem, those imbalances get corrected, because there will be either migration of populations, or there'll be a flow of energy or components in and out, right, to essentially fix those imbalances over time, right? And we're talking about a long time here. We're talking about, you know, several hundreds of years. But when you have a closed ecosystem, that recorrecting of imbalances can't occur, right? So those small differences can be compounded, pardon me, over a very long time. And essentially that's kind of the worry, right? It's not that like very large things from the onset will become an issue. It's more that you can't foresee how these things are going to change over time if there's no corrective mechanisms available to readdress that issue. I think that's really the point. And you know, you're not going to know until you try and do it, basically, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I got to look into those closed, because there was one that NASA did. I think they did it in like some domes, and there was one that was underwater as well. And I can't remember how those, but they all ended really quickly, a lot quicker than intended. And they're only supposed to be for a few years as well, not like several hundred years. Obviously, no one would sign up to that. That'd be nuts. So, simple option: let's travel faster than light. And so this is where things really get into the weeds. And don't ask me any, like, actually you can ask me whatever questions you like, but most likely I'm not going to be able to answer them. And so the whole point about fast and light travel is to bend space-time. And so I only put this in here because you can actually get a crochet pattern of this, of a Lorentzian manifold. And so I think it would be I might actually give it to my daughter to see if she can crochet it for me. I think that would be pretty cool. So this is essentially, Lawrence was a guy who did a whole bunch of stuff on theoretical physics that I don't really understand. He is the guy behind the Lorentzian symmetry. But I don't know what this is. I just put it in there because it looked fun. But essentially, the whole point behind fast and light travel, and I started getting a little, I actually spent a while looking for Scotty quotes to put in here. Hope you appreciate the effort. But the basis behind warp drive is essentially creating a localized space-time bubble where, and this is called an Albusier drive. Essentially, you bend warp time in front of the spacecraft and bend it in the opposite time behind, and so you travel along this little bubble of differential space-time going forward. And supposedly you don't have the issues of like time dilation and stuff, but that's kind of the limits of my understanding. One thing that did strike me as pretty funny was that the amount of radiation produced by this severe curvature of space-time, when it was relaxed, that radiation would most likely kill everything in the system that you arrived in. Which I thought was kind of ironic, really, if you spend all the time trying to get there and then you just wipe everything out with radiation when you arrive.
So what would you have to do? Like stop outside the system and then go in on normal drive?
I don't know, probably point a little bit to the side. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
But actually, it's funny. That's a good question, because in awful lot of like hard science fiction novels, when they do employ like this kind of faster than light travel, it's almost always you have to stop outside the system and then enter the system on normal propulsion, whether that's like chemical or ion drives or antimatter drives or whatever that person used. So actually, that's a good point. I think that sometimes like really hard science fiction I like a lot, because they put an awful lot of research into what's currently known about those particular approaches, and then kind of incorporate that into the story. And so that would probably be a good example of that, I would guess. But anyway, this is a direct quote. It's a hypothetical concept with seemingly difficult problems, and the amount of energy required is thought to be unobtainably large. So there you go. So even though it's a nice concept, it seems to be somewhat impossible. But yeah, anyway, there's a little USS Enterprise there. And so the other option is, instead of this localized disruption of space-time, is to do a large disruption of space-time. And actually, if you start looking into space-time a little too deeply, you start finding that all of these funky models about how space-time isn't actually flat, it's kind of ruffled, and like this Lorentzian manifold, whatever that is. And so the next idea, and this is another kind of staple of science fiction, is to simply bend space-time enough so that you can form a bridge between two space-time surfaces. And so if those two surfaces are sufficiently far apart that it would take a very long time to travel between them, you bring them together by bending that space-time, or taking advantage of existing bends in space-time, whatever those would be caused by. And then you form a bridge called an Einstein-Rosen bridge between them, and that's a wormhole. And so obviously there's some kind, there are difficulties with doing such a thing. And one of them is actually keeping the insides of that wormhole open for long enough for you to pass through it without being squished by it collapsing on you. And so that, in theory, requires negative energy. And I don't really know what that is. Something we haven't found yet. So like dark energy, or maybe antimatter or something like that. To hold that open long enough, and presumably to reduce the radiation to the point where you're not going to die from going through it. And if you were able to do that, then potentially you could travel instantaneously. Well, however long it took you to get through that bridge or that wormhole would be the time it would take you to travel from between those 2 points in space-time. And that's actually depicted really nicely in Interstellar, again, my favorite sci-fi film.
So on that note, so like, are they suggesting that McConaughey opened the wormhole? Like, who opened that wormhole in the first place?
So then you get into the issues of causality, which is very, very confusing. And my brain hurts enough already. So essentially that wormhole was created by the people in the future who needed McConaughey to do what he did, to go into the black hole to get the information, to send it back to his daughter, and then travel back through that wormhole to meet her. in order to be able to save the people so that those people could survive long enough into the future to make the wormhole, so that McConaughey could go through that wormhole to get the data in the black hole to send back to his daughter, so that she could get things so that those people could survive into the future, so that they create the wormhole, and it just goes round and round and round and round again.
Now that makes sense. They sent
Yeah.
it back in time using gravity because of that whatever fifth dimension.
Yeah.
Okay, just checking. I watched it the other day. I was like, what? Wait.
I know.
The rotating space station, was that supposed to be where the wormhole was, or is that just outside of Earth's orbit? Or we don't even know because they talked about multiple stations.
So the one that they were trying to get off the ground, like Plan A originally. So that was actually out by, is that Saturn?
That's what I was thinking, that they said
Yeah.
it was out by Saturn.
It was out by Saturn. So that's essentially kind of what one of those generation ships would look like. But the purpose was not to travel to distant stars, but to provide a home for humanity. I don't know who actually got to choose to go on that, because clearly you're not going to fit 6 billion people on one. So I don't know if there were others, or if it was just, you know, the rich and wealthy and all the poor people got left to starve. I don't know.
I'm sure they tested everyone and picked and choose who they wanted.
Right.
Next question. So we always talk about the Goldilocks zone. Like, was that the point of like the little optical lens at the end of the tunnel, was to amplify the sunlight for growth?
Hang on, you got to speak up a little bit, Jimmy. I can't hear you very well.
Oh, my bad. We'll talk about it later. You continue your lecture.
You're talking about the Goldilocks zone? Like,
yeah, how like that circular space station had like a lens at the end. And if they're not inside the proper distance from the sun, how are they able to grow crops without the right wavelength of sunlight?
Oh, okay. Well, the wavelength doesn't change. It's just the relative intensity, how many of those photons fall on you.
Ah, gotcha. Okay.
So that may be a series of mirrors and lenses, which are used to concentrate that the sunlight, or, which is another kind of staple of science fiction, it's actually it could be a light tube. So it's actually a internally generated light, which is then kind of beamed down the length of the habitat. So that's another fairly common kind of invention, I guess, in these kinds of stories. So essentially, and it's really kind of weird to think about, and the whole them playing a baseball game and smashing a window in a house above them thing.
Yeah.
I mean, there would be
a centrifugal force would cause gravity to go outwards all directions.
Yeah, there would be a Coriolis effect. So that baseball probably would actually go up, and then it would spiral round and it would land somewhere else.
Yeah.
That's obviously harder to do in a film. But yeah, a lot of the ideas is that you'd be able to just look up, and if you weren't staring directly at the light tube, you know, a little bit off axis, you'd be able to see people above you, upside down, staring down at you, which is, that's pretty trippy to think about. Oh, hang on, got a question from Vivian. Sorry, Vivian, missed that. Is that not how you get trapped in a bookshelf? Oh God, so I'm not sure you want to go there, Vivian. That was actually a so that was, again, another really difficult thing to understand about the film, where that was what's called a tesseract. If you remember, we kind of bent our brains around that a little bit last lecture, which is a basically it was a 5-dimensional space in which he could manipulate one of the dimensions, which was gravity. And so that was somehow related to the singularity at the center of that black hole. I don't know how, but it was supposed to have been made by the people in the future who were able to make the wormhole, right? So inside that black hole, somehow, they created that structure to allow him to manipulate gravity. There you go. So that was what the bookshelf was about, but it was purely designed by those people in the future to reflect just that one room because he and his daughter were, you know, the central part to those people's survival into the future, I guess. But I did actually spend some time reading up on, you know, causality and time travel and stuff like that, and can't remember enough of it to be able to try and explain it, and I don't think I understood it very well to begin with. But yeah, it gets pretty crazy, and actually you can get around the issues of causality in particular ways. I just can't remember the exact ways. It'd be worth reading up on. So yeah. Oh, and also this cracked me up. This was in Toronto. Someone was actually just selling a car-sized Starship Enterprise on their lawn.
That's a tragedy.
$1,200, which I thought was a pretty good deal, to be honest. Not sure
Steal.
why. Not sure what I'd do with it. Put it on the roof of our house, I guess. Although the HOA might have issues with that. But anyway, yeah, just kind of an example of the random stuff you find on the internet. So that's pretty much it. So obviously none of this is particularly possible right now, but some of it is plausible, I guess. Obviously relying on a considerable number of technological advancements for any of it to become possible. So probably not in your or my lifetime, but maybe that of our great-grandchildren. Anyway, that's pretty much that. So the idea is to have a catch-up day on Wednesday. So I'll finish updating the study guide, pardon me, after class today, and basically just go through that, go through you know, the PowerPoints that I've posted, and make a list of questions and bring those with you on Wednesday, and then we'll just go through those in turn, make sure everybody gets a chance to ask questions to which they want to hear answers or clarifications. And then the final is on Friday, and then that'll be that. So if anybody's got any questions, Vivian, I'll look up the name of that series on Netflix for you. And yeah, if you got any questions, bring them all on Wednesday, and we'll have a 50 minutes or an hour or so going through those. All right, everybody, that was a lot of fun, obviously, and see you later.
Yes, sir. Appreciate it.
See ya.
Bye, sir.